Hi everyone, I'm Jenika Heim. I'm your EducationUSA Canada Eastern Advisor. I help students in Ontario, Quebec, Atlantic Canada, and up in Nunavut and Northwest Territories. EducationUSA is a free advising service and we're funded by the US State Department. We're talking all about financial aid today. Financial aid is an umbrella term for any money that a university gives a student. When it comes to a domestic student, if you're receiving any sort of financial aid as an American citizen, then that could include loans or US government-based aid. Now, the majority of you are going to be Canadian citizens or not American citizens. And so we're going to speak specifically to what type of aid you qualify for. Financial aid for Canadians is usually going to be what's called gift aid. So gift aid is money you don't need to pay back. So that's scholarships or grants, as opposed to loans. Loans are money that you need to pay back, and that's typically unavailable if you're not a citizen of the United States. There are 4 types of gift aid that we are going to talk about today. First, merit-based aid. Merit-based aid is based on a student's merit, but it could mean a lot of different things depending on the university. So that could be your grades, which may be looked at in their context or converted into a grade point average out of a 4.0 US standard. It could mean standardized test scores. So that would be either the SAT or ACT. SAT or ACT tests are given across Canada and can be used towards your admissions. So merit-based aid might be based on your grades, your test scores, some combination of both, but it could also be based on the entire strength of your application. There's a lot of schools that use what's called the holistic process, and they're reviewing the essays you write, letters from your teachers, maybe from your guidance counselor, and potentially other supplements that the university is required from you. So some merit-based aid is really accounted for the strength of the entire application that you've put together. Applying for merit-based aid is oftentimes concurrent with your application itself. So simply completing your application will allow you to be considered for merit-based aid. However, that's not always the case. Sometimes there might be a separate form that you need to fill out, a separate essay you need to write, or even more likely, maybe an earlier deadline that you need to apply by. So be very cognizant of reviewing deadlines and making sure that you're applying by the priority deadline for scholarships so that you don't accidentally take yourself out of the scholarship race by simply applying to a slightly later deadline. Some schools may have separate organizations that they work with that have some sort of scholarship affiliated with them. For example, the Moorhead Cane's a very popular one that's related to the University of North Carolina, or there's the Florida Canada Linkage Institute, which is related to all the public universities in Florida. It's a little more rare that you need to complete something that's external to the university, but those are 2 examples that I work with students every year who apply to those awards. The second type of aid is called needs-based aid. So needs-based aid is based on a family's finances. And any university that will look at providing needs-based aid will need the family to send from Canada your T4s or any other tax documentation you have, and additional information about money you have in the bank, how many kids are in your family, how many of them are paying how many other university tuitions, things like that. So there's a lot of different factors they take into consideration. Only private schools in the United States will consider needs-based aid for international students. Public schools, basically they never have needs-based aid for international students unless it's a really specific special situation. Oftentimes there's another form that you need to fill out called the CSS profile, and some schools have their own versions of this or will require you to submit that financial documentation directly to the university for them to approve it. There's another one called the International Student Financial Aid Form or something along those lines. The third type of aid is athletic aid. So if you are a student athlete, and is particularly a very good student athlete, someone who wants to keep playing their sport at an elite level, then you might be targeting schools that have some sort of sports scholarship available. The NCAA Divisions 1 and 2 have athletic scholarships available, whereas Division 3 does not. There's another organization called the NAIA that also has scholarships. It has about 150 member schools. And if you're looking at junior colleges, the NJCAA also has athletic scholarships. The most important thing to know about athletic scholarships is that they are not related to the admissions process. You need to be recruited by a coach and offered the scholarship by the coach. And then they work with admissions to ensure that you will receive that scholarship. So the process for being recruited takes place much earlier than the admissions process does. Especially for NCAA Division 1, coaches will start watching athletes as early as grade 9 or grade 10. So it's never too early in high school to start reaching out to coaches and finding ways to get yourself in front of more coaches so that you can start having those scholarship conversations. If you're in grade 11 and you're just getting started, do a lot of outreach to those coaches directly. Send them emails, send them game tape, let them know about your athletic interests, and then see where the conversation goes and what scholarships might be available. Athletic scholarships are a negotiation, and at most schools you can often get other types of aid as well. So if you're being offered a partial athletic scholarship, you could potentially also receive needs or merit-based aid depending on what the university offers. The fourth type of aid is arts-based aid. So this is based on your artistic talent, and it's usually only for students who are actually applying for Bachelor's of Fine Art programs. If you are looking for a performing or fine arts scholarship, then there will need to be a judgment on your abilities in that area. So for the fine arts, that's typically through a portfolio, and through the performing arts, that's through auditions. And these are very, very rigorous processes, and they usually start pretty early. So if you are thinking of applying to schools in the arts, you really need to get started by the end of grade 11 and into the summer of your grade 11 year, preparing your portfolio or your audition so that you can start on the pre-screening. Particularly for performing arts, there's pre-screenings that happen as early as September or October. And a pre-screening is when you submit samples of your work before you might need to do an in-person audition. Portfolios tend to be through Slide Room, which is adjacent to the Common Application itself. And it's an area where you'll get to upload usually pictures of your artistic pieces, as well as a narrative about who you are as an artist. So artistic scholarships are usually not full scholarships, they're usually partial scholarships, and they vary school to school. Some universities don't have them at all, and some have fairly generous scholarships. So part of the search process is determining if the universities that you're considering have these scholarship types. So what other funds can you access as a Canadian? The government here in Canada does allow you to fund your studies outside of the country when you apply through your provincial aid system. You might not be eligible for all types of aid through your province. Basically, if you want to be considered for any types of loans or scholarships, then you can put in an application through your provincial aid system and then see what you are eligible for. So in Ontario, that is called OSAP. In British Columbia, that's called Student Aid BC. Every province has their own aid system. And there'll be a certain number of schools that are already approved, but if your school that you want to go to is not on that list, you can put in a form to have it added to the list. Now, this process varies province to province. If a university in the US is accredited, then you essentially should be able to use some of your government funding in order to go to that school in the United States. So of course you can use your personal funds. If you have an RESP, which is an educational savings account, you can use that to study outside of Canada. Again, that would be towards any accredited education that you're looking for. And of course, if you're interested in loans, then that would also need to be considered within Canada. So you can go to your Canadian bank to see what your options are for student loans. If you do not have American citizenship, as I mentioned earlier, you cannot take out any loans in the United States. All right, the last consideration are independent scholarships. Independent scholarships are really tough because as an international student, it can be really hard to find scholarships that you can take with you to the United States. Any of the large scholarships in Canada stuff like the Loren or the Schulich, those types of big scholarships can only be used towards Canadian universities. Here's a few types that you can try to Google or search through different resources that might be applicable to you. First, major specific. For example, if you're looking at doing computer science, there's a Google scholarship that can be used in the US or Canada for $10,000, but that's specific to computer science majors. So I would recommend doing some Googling to see if there's anything within your specific major that might be similar to that. Second, it could be community-based scholarships. So for example, if you're part of a certain religious community, there could be some scholarships for you to go to religiously based institutions within the same faith. Or if you're from a certain ethnicity, there could be some scholarships that local business associations or just folks in your community have put together. So do take a look and see if any of that's applicable to you. The third one to consider is employers. There's a lot of, especially private employers across Canada, that are based in both countries, US and Canada. So you might find that employers might have certain scholarships available and they might be applicable towards the United States. So that's something that parents can look into and just see if there's any sorts of funding resources that can be accessed. Lastly, there are independent contests that exist that are usually rewarded with money that goes straight to your bank account. Any money that goes straight to your bank account is usually money that you can use towards any type of education that you'd like. So for example, essay contests. Anytime where you need to write a certain essay and receive maybe $1,000 to win that prize, those are the types of things that usually you can take with you to the United States. The toughest thing about these independent types of contests is they usually are a lot of heavy lifting. For example, if you need to read an entire book and then write essentially a book report about it in order to enter into the contest, that's a lot of work. So you'll need to weigh and measure how useful these are and how likely it is you might win and how much time it could take. You might put yourself out there to a lot of different types of essentially contests, which are often called scholarships, and maybe not receive anything in return. But it's also hard to know which ones are actually a good use of time and which ones are not. All right, that's everything you need to get started when it comes to financial aid and understanding what options you have as a Canadian. If you have any more questions, feel free to reach out to Education USA. Check out our website, EducationUSACanada.ca. We have a whole page with a bunch of links related to financial aid resources, and it really goes into more depth of what we talked about here. We also have a document that outlines some institutions that give reduced aid to Canadians based on citizenship or sometimes where you live in Canada. For example, if you live in Manitoba, you can get in-state tuition if you decide to study in Minnesota. Who knew? Definitely check out those resources, and that might help you find some good fit schools that you can access at a lower price point. Thanks again. Watch out for more new videos. Subscribe to our YouTube channel. We've got a lot of great stuff on here, and I'll see you next time. Good luck out there, everyone.